7 P-39. Airacobras climbed through the humid air above New Guinea, their pilots sweating not just from the tropical heat, but from the knowledge that they were flying coffins. The Bell P-39 was a beautiful aircraft on paper, sleek, heavily armed, innovative, but against the legendary Mitsubishi A6M-0, it was a death sentence. The Zero could out-turn it, out-climb it, and out-accelerate it in every scenario that mattered. American pilots had learned this lesson in blood across dozens of engagements. Yet on this morning in August 1943, something was different. Colonel Marcus Webb had spent the previous night with nothing but a paperclip, a maintenance manual, and an idea that would be dismissed as insane by every tactical doctrine in existence. What he discovered would turn 7 obsolete fighters into an execution squad, and the Japanese would never understand what killed them until it was far too late. New Guinea, July 1943, the Valley of Aluminum Coffins. The wreckage told the story better than any after-action report ever could. Lieutenant James Kowalski stood in the clearing 3 miles south of Port Moresby, counting the twisted remains of what had once been P-39 Airacobras. 8. The jungle had already begun reclaiming the 9th, vines threading through the shattered canopy like nature's own eulogy. "They didn't stand a chance," said Sergeant Bill Morrison, his voice flat with the exhaustion that came from burying too many friends. "Zeros hit them during climb-out. Same story every time." Kowalski nodded, his jaw tight. The mathematics of aerial combat in the Southwest Pacific had become brutally simple. P-39 versus 0 equals American body bag. The Bell P-39 Airacobra had arrived in theater with such promise. Its unusual mid-engine design, with the Allison V-1710 mounted behind the pilot and driving the propeller through a long shaft, had freed up space for a devastating 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. On paper, it was a Zero killer. In practice, it was a flying tomb. The problem wasn't the armament. The 37mm cannon could shred a Zero with a single hit. The problem was getting into position to use it. The Zero, with its lightweight construction and powerful Nakajima-Sakai radial engine, could out-accelerate the P-39 in the critical altitude band between 10,000 and 20,000 feet, where most combat occurred. Worse, it could outturn the American fighter in any configuration, and its climb rate was superior by nearly 500 feet per minute. Colonel Marcus Webb had watched the losses mount with growing fury. A veteran of the European theater, before his transfer to the Pacific, Webb understood that wars were won not just by courage, but by adaptation. The Japanese had adapted brilliantly. Their tactics exploited every weakness of the P-39. American pilots, following doctrine developed for different aircraft against different enemies, were dying at a rate that would decimate the entire fighter group within 6 months. The statistics were damning. Between April and July 1943, the 35th Fighter Group had lost 42 P-39s in combat. They had claimed only 11 confirmed Zero kills. A kill ratio of 1.3.8 was unsustainable, unacceptable, and, according to every tactical manual Webb had studied, unavoidable given the aircraft's limitations. But Webb had not survived 3 years of war by accepting the unavoidable. It was during a sweltering evening in late July, after yet another funeral detail, that Webb found himself alone in the maintenance hangar. The day's losses had been particularly brutal. 4 P-39s downed, 3 pilots dead, 1 captured. The sole survivor, Captain Eddie Rourke, had described the engagement with the hollow voice of a man who'd seen his own death and somehow missed the appointment. "We tried to climb away," Rourke had said, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. "Doctrine says use our speed advantage, right? Extend away, climb, reset the engagement, but the Zeros just climbed right with us. Faster. They got above us and came down like hawks. We never had a chance to use our guns." Webb had dismissed Rourke to the medical tent and walked to the hangar, his mind churning. The P-39's engine sat before him on a maintenance stand, its Allison V1710 gleaming dully in the lamplight. 1,200 horsepower. Not enough, not at altitude, where the supercharger couldn't compensate for the thin air. He picked up a paperclip from a nearby desk, a mundane object, the kind of thing that held together requisition forms and casualty reports. He bent it absently, his engineer's mind working through the problem from first principles. The P-39 couldn't out-accelerate the Zero. Fact. The P-39 couldn't out-climb the Zero. Fact. The P-39 couldn't out-turn the Zero. Fact. But what if acceleration wasn't about the engine alone? Webb's hands stilled. He stared at the paperclip, now bent into a rough approximation of a flight profile, a steep dive followed by a sharp climb. The idea that crystallized in his mind was so simple, so obvious, that he immediately distrusted it. Every instinct trained into him by years of aerial combat doctrine screamed that it was suicide, but the current doctrine was already suicide. At least this would be suicide with a chance. The principle was elementary physics, the kind taught to every aviation cadet. Potential energy converts to kinetic energy. An aircraft at altitude possesses potential energy proportional to its height. In a dive, that potential energy converts to speed, kinetic energy. The question was whether that conversion could be controlled, optimized, and weaponized in a way that negated the Zero's natural advantages. Webb spent the next 4 hours with the maintenance chief, Captain Harold Voss, a former aeronautical engineer from Boeing who'd enlisted after Pearl Harbor. Together, they worked through the mathematics on a chalkboard that still bore the previous week's duty roster. The P-39's power-to-weight ratio at 15,000 feet is 0.089 horsepower per pound, Voss said, chalk scratching across the board. The Zero's is 0.095. That's your acceleration deficit right there, 6%. Doesn't sound like much, but in a climb fight, it's the difference between life and death. What if we don't climb fight? Webb asked. Voss paused. Sir, if you try to turn with a Zero, not turn, dive. Webb took the chalk and drew a steep descending line. From 22,000 feet to 8,000 feet, full throttle, full dive. What's our terminal velocity? Voss's eyes widened as he understood. Jesus, you want to trade altitude for speed before the engagement even starts. The Zero's lightweight construction is its strength in a climb, Webb said, his voice gaining intensity. But it's a weakness in a dive. Their airframe can't handle the same G-loads and speeds our birds can. If we start 8,000 feet above them and dive to their altitude, we'll be carrying 450, maybe 480 miles per hour when we reach them. And they'll be doing what, 280 in level flight? Voss was already calculating. That's a 200-mile-per-hour speed advantage. But, sir, you'll only have one pass. After that, you're slow again, and they'll be all over you. Webb smiled grimly. Then we make that one pass count. 7 aircraft, diving in sequence, each one targeting a different Zero. We don't dogfight. We don't turn. We dive, we shoot, and we extend away using the speed we've built up. By the time they react, we're gone. And if you miss, then we climb back to altitude and do it again. They can't follow us up, not if we use our dive speed to zoom climb. We'll be back at 22,000 feet before they can intercept. Voss stared at the chalkboard, his expression shifting from skepticism to cautious excitement. It's insane. It violates every principle of energy management we teach. No, Webb corrected. It violates every principle of sustained combat. But we're not sustaining combat. We're executing ambushes, hit and run. The Zero is built for the knife fight. We're bringing a sniper rifle. Over the next 3 days, Webb refined the concept with obsessive precision. He called it the Paperclip maneuver, a name that would later be sanitized in official reports to high-altitude dive intercept tactics. But among the pilots it would always be the Paperclip. The maneuver required perfect coordination. 7 P-39s would climb to 22,000 feet, an altitude where the Zero's performance advantage was diminished and where American aircraft could operate more effectively. They would patrol in a loose formation, waiting for Japanese fighters to appear below them, typically at 14,000 to 16,000 feet, where the Zeros preferred to hunt. When contact was made, the P-39s would not descend to engage at the enemy's altitude. Instead, they would position themselves directly above the Zero formation and then, on Webb's signal, roll into near vertical dives. Each pilot would select a target before diving. No mid-dive target changes, no hesitation. The dive would continue until the P-39 reached the Zero's altitude, at which point the pilot would pull out, fire a burst from the 37mm cannon and machine guns, and then use the tremendous speed built up in the dive to zoom climb back to altitude. The key was discipline. Pilots had to resist every instinct to pursue, to turn, to engage in the swirling dogfight that the Zero excelled at. One pass, one kill, then escape. It was the antithesis of fighter-pilot culture, which glorified the ace, the dogfighter, the man who stayed in the fight until he or his enemy was dead. Webb knew he was asking his pilots to become something different, precision executioners rather than knights of the air. The skepticism was immediate and vocal. During the briefing on August 2nd, Captain Rourke, the same man who'd barely survived the previous week's massacre, stood up and voiced what many were thinking. "Colonel, with respect, this is suicide. We dive on them. We're committed. If we miss, we're dead. And sir, hitting a maneuvering Zero in a 400-mile-per-hour dive, that's not shooting, that's praying." Webb had expected this. "Captain, what's our current survival rate engaging Zeros in level combat?" Rourke's jaw tightened. "Low, sir." "Quantify it." 38% of pilots engaged in the last month didn't come back. "And our kill ratio?" Silence. 1 to 4, Webb said flatly. "For every Zero we kill, we lose 4 P-39s. Gentlemen, we are losing this war one funeral at a time. What I'm proposing isn't safe, but it's mathematics. The Zero cannot dive with us. It cannot sustain the speeds we can, and it cannot climb fast enough to catch us when we zoom back to altitude. We take away every advantage they have and impose our will on the engagement." Lieutenant Thomas "Hawk" Hawkins, a lanky Texan with 6 missions and no kills, raised his hand. "Colonel, even if the theory works, how do we practice this without getting killed in training?" It was a valid question. Webb had already worked out the answer with Voss. "We practice the dive profile against ground targets. We practice the zoom climb. We practice formation discipline. And then, gentlemen, we do it for real, because the Japanese are going to give us plenty of opportunities." The training began immediately. For 5 days, the 7 pilots Webb had selected, the best marksmen, the most disciplined flyers, the men who could follow orders even when every instinct screamed otherwise, practiced diving on ground targets marked in the jungle. They learned to judge the exact moment to pull out, to fire during the brief window when their guns would be on target, and to resist the urge to pull harder on the stick to track a maneuvering target. The 37mm cannon became their obsession. Unlike machine guns, which could spray bullets and hope for hits, the 37mm fired slowly, 1 round every second or so. Each shot had to count. The pilots learned to fire in the last 500 feet of their dive, a 2-second burst that would send 2 or 3 massive shells toward the target. On August 7, 1943, reconnaissance reported a formation of 12 Zeros escorting bombers toward Port Moresby. Webb scrambled his 7 P-39s and climbed to 22,000 feet, positioning his flight between the sun and the expected Japanese approach route. The trap was set. The paperclip was about to be tested in blood. August 7, 1943, 08:47 hours, 22,000 feet above the Coral Sea. The oxygen mask pressed cold against Colonel Marcus Webb's face, each breath a mechanical reminder that he was operating at the edge of his aircraft's envelope. At 22,000 feet, the P-39 Airacobra was sluggish, the thin air starving the Allison engine of the oxygen it craved. The aircraft felt heavy, unresponsive, a far cry from the nimble fighter it became at lower altitudes. But that was precisely the point. Paperclip lead to all flights, maintain spacing, eyes down and forward. They'll be coming from the northwest, probably stacked between 14 and 16,000. Webb's voice crackled through the radio, calm despite the adrenaline beginning to sharpen his senses. 6 acknowledgements came back, each pilot confirming position. Webb had arranged them in a loose trail formation, each aircraft separated by 500 feet of altitude and a quarter-mile of lateral distance. From above, they would have looked like a descending staircase frozen in the sky. The formation was unconventional, designed not for mutual support in a dogfight, but for sequential attack. Each pilot would dive in turn, creating a cascade of attackers that would give the enemy no time to react between strikes. Lieutenant Hawkins, flying Paperclip 3, keyed his mic. "Lead, this is 3. I've got visual, 11 o'clock low, approximately 8,000 feet below us. Count 12. No, 14 contacts, zeros in finger 4 formations." Webb's pulse quickened, but his voice remained steady. "Confirmed. All flights, begin your descent to attack altitude. Maintain dive discipline. Select your targets now." The Japanese formation was beautiful in its precision. 3 groups of 4 Zeros, plus 2 additional fighters flying top cover about 2,000 feet above the main formation. They were heading southeast at approximately 16,000 feet, completely unaware of the American fighters lurking in the sun glare above them. Webb pushed the stick forward gently, beginning a shallow descent that would position him directly above his chosen target, the lead 0 in the northernmost formation. His airspeed began to build, 220 miles per hour, 240, 260. The P-39's nose dropped further, and the world began to tilt. Paperclip lead is rolling in. Count to 5 and follow. Remember, 1 pass, 1 kill, then climb. Do not pursue. Webb rolled inverted and pulled the stick back into his stomach. The world spun, and suddenly he was pointing straight down at the earth. The coral sea, a glittering expanse of blue-green far below, the Japanese fighters now appearing as tiny, cruciform shapes directly in his gun sight. The dive was terrifying. At 22,000 feet, the air was thin and cold. As Webb plummeted earthward, the air grew thicker, denser, and his airspeed increased with shocking rapidity. 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. The P-39's airframe began to shudder, the controls stiffening as aerodynamic forces built up. The altimeter unwound like a broken clock. 20,000 feet, 19,000, 18,000. Webb's vision began to narrow, the G-forces of the dive pressing him into his seat. He had to fight the stick now, the aircraft wanting to continue its plunge toward the ocean. His target, the lead 0, was growing larger in his gun sight, the distinctive profile of the Japanese fighter becoming clearer with each passing second. 17,000 feet. The 0 was still in level flight, unaware. Webb could see the meatball insignia on its wings now, the sun glinting off its canopy. 16,500 feet. Webb's thumb moved to the firing button. The 37mm cannon was armed, the 2 50-caliber machine guns in the nose ready. He had perhaps 3 seconds before he would have to pull out of the dive or risk slamming into his target. 16,200 feet. The 0 filled his gun sight. Webb could see the pilot's head now, the man completely oblivious to the ton of American fury screaming down at him at 430 miles per hour. Webb pressed the trigger. The 37mm cannon roared, its recoil shuddering through the entire airframe. Thump, thump, thump. 3 massive shells, each weighing nearly 2 pounds, lanced through the air at 2,000 feet per second. The 50-caliber machine guns added their own staccato rhythm, tracers drawing a line of fire from Webb's nose to the 0's fuselage. The first 37mm shell missed, passing just ahead of the 0's propeller. The second struck the engine cowling and detonated, the high-explosive round blowing a hole the size of a basketball through the Nakajima radial engine. The third shell hit the cockpit. The 0 disintegrated. One moment, it was a functioning aircraft. The next, it was a cloud of debris tumbling through the sky, pieces of wing and fuselage spinning away like leaves in a hurricane. Webb had no time to watch. He was pulling back on the stick with both hands, the G-forces slamming him down into his seat with crushing force. His vision grayed at the edges, blood draining from his head as the P-39 pulled out of its dive at 15,800 feet. And then he was climbing, the tremendous speed he'd built up in the dive, now converting back into altitude. The P-39 rocketed upward, passing through 17,000 feet, 18,000, 19,000. Webb's airspeed bled off rapidly, 400 miles per hour, 350, 300. But he was climbing faster than any Zero could follow. Behind him, the Japanese formation had exploded into chaos. Lieutenant Hawkins had followed Webb down exactly 5 seconds later, his dive profile identical. His target, the number 2 Zero in the same formation, never knew what hit him. Hawkins's 37mm burst caught the Japanese fighter in the wing root, and the entire wing folded upward, snapping off at the fuselage. The Zero entered a flat spin, its pilot already dead from the hydrostatic shock of the shell's impact. Captain Eddie Rourke, flying Paperclip 4, had selected one of the top cover Zeros. His dive was steeper, nearly vertical, and his closure rate was so high that he almost overshot. But Rourke was a gifted marksman, and his burst was perfectly timed. The Zero's tail section simply vanished, blown off by a direct hit from a 37mm shell. The fighter tumbled forward, its pilot ejecting but his parachute shredding in the slipstream. In the span of 15 seconds, 3 Zeros had been destroyed, and the American fighters were already climbing back to altitude. The Japanese reaction was exactly what Webb had predicted: confusion and disbelief. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto, leading the Zero formation, had seen the first explosion, but hadn't understood what caused it. One moment his wingman was flying in perfect formation, the next the aircraft was gone, replaced by a fireball. Yamamoto's first thought was mechanical failure, perhaps a fuel tank rupture. Then the second Zero exploded, and the third. Yamamoto's radio erupted with panicked voices, his pilots shouting warnings and questions in a cacophony of confusion. He craned his neck, searching the sky above, and finally saw them, American fighters, climbing away at impossible angles, already 3,000 feet above his formation and still ascending. "All units! Climb! Climb now!" Yamamoto shouted, hauling back on his stick. The Zero responded instantly, its powerful engine and lightweight airframe sending it upward at 3,000 feet per minute. But the Americans were already at 21,000 feet and still climbing. By the time Yamamoto reached 19,000 feet, they had disappeared into the sun glare, invisible and untouchable. For 30 seconds, there was an eerie calm. The Japanese formation had scattered, pilots looking in every direction for the threat. 3 of their number were gone, and no one had even seen the attackers clearly. Then the Americans came again. Webb had reached 23,000 feet and immediately rolled into another dive. This time, his target was Yamamoto himself, the lead Zero now isolated and vulnerable. The dive was a repeat of the first, a screaming plunge from the heavens, airspeed building to terrifying levels, the target growing in the gun sight. But Yamamoto was a veteran with over 200 combat hours. He saw the diving fighter this time, recognized the tactic, and reacted with the instincts of a survivor. He rolled hard left and pulled, throwing his Zero into a violent, evasive maneuver. Webb's burst missed, the 37mm shells passing through empty air where the Zero had been a fraction of a second earlier. Webb cursed and continued his zoom climb, refusing to turn and pursue. Discipline. One pass, then escape. But Lieutenant Kowalski, flying Paperclip 6, had anticipated the evasion. He delayed his dive by an extra 2 seconds, watching Yamamoto's maneuver, and adjusted his aim point. When he fired, his burst caught the Zero in its turn, the 37mm shells striking the fuselage just behind the cockpit. Yamamoto's Zero broke in half. The Japanese commander had time for one final thought, a flash of understanding that he'd been outmaneuvered by an enemy he'd considered inferior before the aircraft disintegrated around him. 4 zeros down. The Americans climbed away again, untouched. The remaining Japanese pilots were now in full panic. Their radios were a chaos of shouted warnings and pleas for orders. The top cover had descended to help, but they were too slow, too late. The Americans were already repositioning for another attack. Sergeant Bill Morrison, flying Paperclip 7, had been the last to dive in the first wave. Now he was the first in the second, and his target was a Zero that had broken formation and was attempting to flee toward the north. Morrison's dive was textbook perfect, his closure rate so high that the Zero pilot never had a chance to evade. The 37mm burst struck the engine, and the Zero's propeller tore free, the aircraft immediately entering an uncontrollable tumble. 5 Zeros destroyed. The engagement had lasted less than 3 minutes. The remaining Japanese fighters broke and ran, their formations shattered, their morale destroyed. They dove for the deck, seeking the safety of low altitude, where the Americans, according to all their intelligence and experience, would have the advantage. But Webb didn't follow. He reformed his flight at 22,000 feet, counted his aircraft, all 7 present and undamaged, and set course for home. The bomber formation the Zeros had been escorting turned back, their mission aborted without their fighter cover. As Webb's flight descended toward Port Moresby, the radio chatter was jubilant. Hawkins was whooping, Rourke was laughing, and even the normally taciturn Kowalski was grinning inside his oxygen mask. But Webb felt no elation, only a grim satisfaction. The tactic had worked. The Paperclip maneuver had turned 7 obsolete fighters into an execution squad. But he knew this was only the beginning. The Japanese would adapt, would learn, would develop counters. The war was far from over. But for the first time in months, American pilots had proven they could not just survive against the Zero, they could dominate it. The landing was smooth, the ground crews cheering as the 7 P-39s taxied to their revetments. As Webb climbed out of his cockpit, Captain Voss was waiting, a broad smile on his face. 5 confirmed kills, Colonel. No losses, no damage. I'd say your paperclip theory just became doctrine. Webb nodded, but his mind was already on the next mission. Get the birds refueled and rearmed. The Japanese will be back, and next time they'll be expecting us. We need to be ready. The paperclip maneuver had passed its first test, but the real challenge, sustaining the tactic against an enemy that would inevitably adapt, was just beginning. Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service Headquarters, Rabaul, August 8, 1943. Commander Hiroshi Nakamura stared at the after-action reports spread across his desk with the expression of a man confronting an impossible equation. A veteran intelligence officer with 3 years of combat analysis experience, Nakamura had reviewed thousands of engagement reports. He understood the patterns of aerial combat, the ebb and flow of tactical advantage, the predictable rhythms of how American pilots fought. This made no sense. 12 aircraft departed, 7 returned, 5 pilots confirmed killed in action. Nakamura read the summary aloud, his voice flat. Engagement duration, approximately 3 minutes. American losses, 0. American aircraft type, P-39 Airacobra. Lieutenant Sato, his junior analyst, shifted uncomfortably. Sir, the surviving pilots' accounts are inconsistent. Inconsistent how? They claim the Americans attacked from directly above, diving at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. They describe the attacks as sequential, with no sustained combat. The American fighters would dive, fire a single burst, and then climb away before our pilots could engage. Nakamura's eyes narrowed. The P-39 cannot outclimb the Zero. This is established fact. We have test data from captured aircraft. The Zero's climb rate is superior by nearly 500 feet per minute at combat altitudes. Yes, sir. That's what makes the report so troubling. The surviving pilots insist the Americans climbed away after each attack and that our fighters could not catch them. Nakamura stood and walked to the large tactical map covering one wall of his office. Red pins marked Japanese positions. Blue pins marked known American air bases. The Southwest Pacific Theater was a complex web of overlapping patrol zones, supply routes, and contested airspace. For 2 years, Japanese fighters had dominated this airspace, their Zeros establishing a reputation for invincibility that had become a cornerstone of Japanese tactical doctrine. The P-39 Airacobra had been a gift to Japanese pilots, a mediocre American fighter that could be defeated with textbook tactics. Intelligence reports had consistently rated it as inferior to the Zero in every meaningful category. Japanese pilots had learned to exploit its weaknesses ruthlessly, engage in turning fights, force it into sustained combat, use superior climb rate to gain altitude advantage. And yet, 5 Zeros had been destroyed in 3 minutes without inflicting a single loss on the Americans. "What do we know about the American commander?" Nakamura asked. Sato consulted his notes. "Radio intercepts identified the flight leader as Paperclip Lead. We believe this is Colonel Marcus Webb, recently transferred from the European Theater. He commands the 35th Fighter Group's Tactical Development Section." "European Theater," Nakamura repeated thoughtfully. "So he's accustomed to fighting Germans, not us. He doesn't know our tactics. Or perhaps, sir, he knows them too well and has developed a counter." Nakamura turned sharply. "Explain." Sato approached the map, pointing to the location of the engagement. The Americans positioned themselves at 22,000 feet, well above our standard patrol altitude. They waited for our formation to pass beneath them, then attacked using pure vertical tactics, diving attacks with no horizontal maneuvering. Every advantage the Zero possesses, turn rate, sustained climb, acceleration in level flight, was rendered irrelevant. "But the P-39 cannot sustain such tactics," Nakamura objected. "After the dive, they would be slow, vulnerable. Our pilots should have been able to engage them during their climb." "Sir, the surviving pilots report that the Americans were not slow after their dives. They used the speed built up in the dive to zoom climb, trading kinetic energy for altitude. By the time our pilots reacted, the Americans were already 5,000 feet above them and climbing." Nakamura felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. If Sato's analysis was correct, the Americans had found a way to completely negate the Zero's advantages. Worse, they had done so using an aircraft that every Japanese pilot had been trained to consider inferior. "This cannot be a sustainable tactic," Nakamura said, more to convince himself than Sato. "The Americans would need perfect conditions, altitude advantage, surprise, and targets that don't evade. In a fluid combat situation, this tactic would fail." "Perhaps, sir. But what if they don't engage in fluid combat? What if they simply refuse to fight, except on their terms?" It was a disturbing thought. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive engagement, closing with the enemy and destroying him in close combat. The Zero had been designed for this philosophy, a lightweight, maneuverable fighter that excelled in the swirling dogfight. But if the Americans refused to dogfight, if they simply attacked from above, and then escaped before the Zero could respond. Nakamura returned to his desk and pulled out a technical manual on the P-39 Airacobra. He'd studied it before, noting its weaknesses with satisfaction. Now he read it with new eyes, looking for strengths he'd previously dismissed. Maximum dive speed, 475 miles per hour, significantly higher than the Zero's 410 miles per hour limit. Service ceiling, 36,000 feet. Higher than the Zero's 33,000 feet. Armament, 1 37mm cannon, 2 50 caliber machine guns. Devastating firepower if it could be brought to bear. The pieces began to fall into place. The P-39 was a poor dogfighter, but it was a superb boom and zoom platform. Its heavy construction allowed it to dive faster and pull harder than the Zero. Its armament meant it only needed a single hit to destroy a target, and if the Americans maintained altitude discipline, they could dictate the terms of every engagement. "We need to warn all fighter units immediately," Nakamura said, his voice urgent. New tactical directive. American P-39 formations operating at high altitude are to be considered extreme threats. Do not engage unless you have altitude parity or superiority. Do not pursue diving attackers. Maintain formation integrity and climb immediately if attacked from above. Sato was already writing, "Sir, should we recommend avoiding engagement entirely?" Nakamura hesitated. To recommend avoiding combat with an enemy previously considered inferior would be humiliating. It would also be a tacit admission that Japanese tactical doctrine had a fatal flaw. But the alternative was to continue losing pilots and aircraft to an enemy that had found a way to fight outside the boundaries of conventional aerial combat. "No," Nakamura said finally. "We engage, but on our terms. We climb to match their altitude before entering their patrol zones. We use our own high-altitude formations to deny them the vertical advantage. And we develop new tactics specifically to counter this paperclip maneuver." But even as he gave the orders, Nakamura felt a deep unease. The Americans had changed the rules of the game, and the Japanese were now playing catch-up. In war, the side that reacts is the side that loses. Lae Airfield, New Guinea, August 10th, 1943. Flight Petty Officer Kenji Watanabe sat in the briefing hut, listening to his squadron commander describe the new American tactics with growing disbelief. Watanabe was a veteran with 43 combat missions and 7 confirmed kills. He'd flown Zero since the beginning of the war, and he knew his aircraft's capabilities intimately. "The Americans are using high-altitude ambush tactics," Commander Ishida explained, pointing to a crude diagram on the chalkboard. "They position themselves above our formations and dive to attack. They do not engage in sustained combat. After their attack, they climb away using the speed from their dive." One of the younger pilots raised his hand. "Sir, the P-39 cannot outclimb us. Why don't we simply follow them up?" Ishida's expression was grim. "Because by the time you react, they already have a 5,000-foot altitude advantage and 200 miles per hour of speed. You cannot catch them, and if you try, you'll be slow and vulnerable when they dive on you again." Watanabe felt a surge of anger. This was cowardice, not tactics. The Americans were refusing to fight like men, instead striking from ambush and fleeing before the Zero could demonstrate its superiority. It was dishonorable, unsporting, and, he had to admit, devastatingly effective. "So what do we do?" Watanabe asked. "Refuse to fly below 20,000 feet. We climb to their altitude before entering contested airspace," Ishida replied. "We deny them the vertical advantage, and if we encounter them at equal altitude, we engage using standard tactics. The P-39 is still inferior in a turning fight." "But, sir," another pilot objected, "climbing to 22,000 feet before every patrol will consume enormous amounts of fuel. Our patrol time will be cut in half." "Then our patrol time is cut in half," Ishida snapped. "Better that than losing half our pilots to an enemy we cannot engage." The briefing continued, but Watanabe's mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the American colonel who developed this tactic, this web. What kind of man fights from ambush, refusing honorable combat? What kind of warrior strikes and runs rather than standing and fighting? A smart one, Watanabe realized with grudging respect. A man who understood that honor was a luxury the losing side couldn't afford. Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service Headquarters, Rabaul, August 15th, 1943. 1 week after the first paperclip engagement, Commander Nakamura received reports of 3 more encounters. The pattern was identical. American P-39s at high altitude, diving attacks, Japanese losses, 0 American casualties. The kill ratio had shifted from 4.1 in Japan's favor to 11.0 in America's favor. Nakamura's superiors were demanding answers. How had an inferior American fighter suddenly become dominant? What had changed? And most importantly, how could Japanese forces counter this new threat? Nakamura worked through the night, analyzing every scrap of intelligence, every pilot report, every radio intercept. He built a profile of the paperclip maneuver, identifying its strengths and weaknesses. Strengths: exploited the P-39's superior dive speed and structural strength, negated the Zero's advantages in turn rate and sustained climb, allowed inferior numbers to achieve superior results through surprise and concentration of force, required minimal pilot skill. The tactic was more about discipline and positioning than dogfighting ability. Weaknesses: required altitude advantage to initiate, vulnerable if caught at equal altitude, ineffective against targets with high situational awareness, dependent on surprise. If the target evaded the initial dive, the attacker had to disengage. The solution was clear: deny the Americans their altitude advantage. Japanese fighters would have to climb to 23,000 feet or higher before entering contested airspace. They would need to maintain constant vigilance, scanning the sky above for diving attackers. And they would need to develop new formations that could respond quickly to vertical threats. But implementing these changes would take time, training, and resources. In the meantime, American P-39s were slaughtering Japanese fighters with impunity. Nakamura drafted his report with a heavy heart. The Americans had not developed a new aircraft or a new weapon. They had simply found a way to use an existing aircraft in a manner that exploited its strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. It was a lesson in tactical innovation, and the Japanese were paying for their complacency in blood. The report concluded with a stark warning. The enemy has demonstrated that aircraft performance is less important than tactical employment. We have relied too heavily on the Zero's technical superiority and have neglected tactical development. If we do not adapt immediately, we will lose air superiority in the Southwest Pacific within 3 months. The report was forwarded up the chain of command, where it was read, discussed, and ultimately filed away. The Japanese High Command, confident in their pilot skill and their aircraft superiority, could not accept that a fundamental shift in aerial combat had occurred. They would learn the truth soon enough, but by then, it would be too late. Port Moresby, New Guinea, August 22, 1943, 05:30 hours. The explosion shattered the pre-dawn silence, a thunderous roar that sent Colonel Marcus Webb rolling out of his cot and onto the floor of his tent. For a disorienting moment, he thought they were under artillery attack. Then came the secondary explosions, smaller, sharper, the unmistakable sound of ammunition cooking off. Webb grabbed his boots and ran outside. The eastern sky was brightening with the approaching dawn. But a different light dominated the airfield, flames towering 50 feet into the air, consuming the fuel depot at the north end of the runway. "Sabotage!" someone shouted. Japanese infiltrators hit the fuel dump. Webb's mind raced through the implications. The fuel depot contained 80,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, enough to keep his fighter group operational for 2 weeks. If it was gone, the paperclip maneuver was finished. The tactic depended on climbing to extreme altitude, which consumed fuel at prodigious rates. Without adequate fuel reserves, his P-39s would be grounded. Captain Voss appeared at Webb's side, his face illuminated by the orange glow of the fire. "Sir, it's bad. The main tanks are gone. We've got maybe 12,000 gallons left in the auxiliary storage, and that's contaminated with seawater from the firefighting efforts. How long can we operate? 3 days, maybe 4 if we ration strictly. After that, we're done until the supply convoy arrives from Australia." "When's the convoy due?" Voss's expression answered before his words did. 2 weeks, sir. Maybe 3 if the weather's bad." Webb felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. For 2 weeks, his fighter group had been winning. The paperclip maneuver had shifted the balance of power in the Southwest Pacific, giving American pilots a tactical advantage they'd never possessed before. But tactics meant nothing without fuel. The Japanese had struck at the one vulnerability Webb hadn't adequately protected: logistics. All right, Webb said, forcing his voice to remain calm. Get the fire under control, salvage whatever fuel we can, and get me a meeting with all squadron commanders in 1 hour. We need to figure out how to keep fighting with what we have. The meeting was grim. 7 squadron commanders, representing 42 operational P-39s, sat in the operations tent and listened as Voss laid out the mathematics of their predicament. Each Paperclip mission consumes approximately 180 gallons of fuel per aircraft, Voss explained. That's climbing to 22,000 feet, maintaining patrol altitude for 30 minutes, executing dive attacks and returning to base. With 12,000 gallons of usable fuel, we can fly approximately 66 sorties total. That's less than 2 full group missions. Captain Rourke leaned forward. What if we reduce patrol time? Cut it to 15 minutes instead of 30. That saves about 40 gallons per sortie, which gives us maybe 90 total sorties. Still not enough to maintain operations for 2 weeks. Lieutenant Hawkins spoke up. What if we don't climb to 22,000 feet? What if we patrol at 18,000 or 20,000? Webb shook his head. Then we lose the altitude advantage that makes the Paperclip work. The Japanese have already adapted. Their fighters are climbing higher before entering our patrol zones. If we're at 18,000 feet, they'll be at 20,000, and we're back to fighting at a disadvantage. The tent fell silent. The problem seemed insurmountable. They needed altitude to execute their tactics, but achieving that altitude consumed the fuel they didn't have. It was Lieutenant Kowalski who broke the silence. Sir, what if we don't patrol at all? Webb frowned. Explain. The Paperclip maneuver works because we have altitude advantage when the Japanese arrive, but we're burning fuel maintaining that altitude, waiting for them to show up. What if we don't wait? What if we scramble only when we have confirmed targets? We'd lose the element of surprise, Rourke objected. By the time we climb to altitude, the Japanese would be past our intercept point. Not if we change our intercept geometry, Kowalski countered. He stood and moved to the map table, tracing a line with his finger. The Japanese bombers follow predictable routes. They're targeting Port Moresby, which means they have to approach from the northwest. We know their speed. We know their altitude. If we scramble the moment radar picks them up, we can climb to intercept altitude while they're still 50 miles out. We meet them at altitude, already positioned for the dive attack. Webb studied the map, his mind working through the calculations. Kowalski was right. The Japanese were predictable. They had to be. Their bombers lacked the range to take circuitous routes, and their fighters had to stay close to provide escort. If American fighters could time their climb to arrive at intercept altitude exactly when the Japanese formation reached the engagement zone. It's risky, Webb said slowly. If our timing is off, we'll be caught mid-climb, vulnerable. And we only get one chance. If we miss the intercept, we won't have fuel to try again. But if it works, Voss interjected, we cut our fuel consumption by 2/3. Instead of burning fuel on patrol, we only burn what we need for the intercept. That extends our operational capability from 3 days to 9 or 10. Webb looked around the tent, seeing the mix of hope and apprehension on his commanders' faces. The plan was audacious, requiring split-second timing and perfect coordination between radar operators, ground controllers, and pilots. A single mistake, a delayed scramble, a miscalculated intercept vector, a radar malfunction, would leave his fighters exposed and vulnerable. But the alternative was to stop flying altogether, to cede air superiority back to the Japanese and watch as enemy bombers pounded Port Moresby into rubble. All right, Webb decided. We implement scramble intercepts starting immediately. Boss, work with radar operations to develop intercept timing tables. I want to know exactly when to scramble based on target distance, altitude, and speed. Rourke, you'll coordinate with ground control to ensure we have real-time updates during the climb. Kowalski, you're my backup flight leader. If something happens to me, you take over. The commanders dispersed to their tasks, leaving Webb alone with the map. He traced the likely Japanese approach routes, calculating angles and distances, trying to anticipate every variable that could go wrong. The paperclip maneuver had been born from desperation and innovation. Now it would have to evolve again, adapting to a new constraint. Webb wondered how many more times they would have to reinvent their tactics before the war finally turned in their favor. August 23, 1943, 10:15 hours. The radar operator's voice crackled through the operations tent speaker. Bogies, bearing 315, range 60 miles, altitude 16,000, speed 180 knots, count 12 plus contacts. Webb was already moving, his hand keying the scramble alarm. The klaxon wailed across the airfield, and pilots sprinted from the ready tent toward their aircraft. Webb reached his P-39 in 40 seconds, the ground crew already pulling the wheel chocks. "Fuel load!" Webb shouted to his crew chief. 140 gallons, sir. That's all we can spare." Webb's stomach tightened. 140 gallons was barely enough for the mission profile. Climb to altitude, execute one attack, return to base. There would be no margin for error, no fuel for a second pass or extended combat. The Allison engine roared to life, and Webb taxied toward the runway, 6 other P-39s falling into line behind him. The entire scramble, from alarm to wheels up, took 4 minutes and 30 seconds. "Paperclip lead is airborne," Webb transmitted. "Ground control, give me a vector. Paperclip lead, steer 320, climb to Angels 22. Bogies now bearing 320, range 52 miles, altitude 16,000, time to intercept 11 minutes. 11 minutes. Webb pushed the throttle to maximum continuous power and hauled back on the stick, pointing the P-39's nose skyward. The aircraft clawed for altitude, the Allison engines screaming at full power, 5,000 feet, 8,000 feet, 10,000 feet. Webb's eyes flicked constantly between the altimeter, the clock, and the fuel gauge. They were burning fuel at an alarming rate. The climb to 22,000 feet would consume nearly 80 gallons, leaving only 60 for the engagement and return flight. Paperclip lead, bogies now bearing 325, range 38 miles. You are on intercept course. Estimate you will reach Angels 22 with bogies at Angels 16, range 5 miles. Perfect. If the timing held, Webb's flight would arrive at 22,000 feet, with the Japanese formation 6,000 feet below them and 5 miles ahead. Ideal geometry for a paperclip attack. 15,000 feet, 18,000 feet, 20,000 feet. The air was thin now, the engine laboring. Webb's oxygen mask hissed with each breath, the cold air at altitude seeping through his flight suit. Paperclip lead, bogies bearing 328, range 12 miles. You should have visual. Webb scanned the sky ahead, squinting against the glare. There, a formation of dark specks against the lighter sky, moving southeast. Bombers, probably Mitsubishi G4Ms, with 0 escorts above and to the sides. Paperclip lead has visual. All flights, arm weapons, and prepare for attack run. We're going in hot. But as Webb positioned his flight for the dive, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The 0 escorts were climbing. They'd spotted the American fighters and were ascending to meet them, their lightweight airframes allowing them to climb faster than the heavily loaded P-39s. The Japanese had adapted. They weren't going to allow the Americans to maintain altitude advantage. "Paperclip lead! The escorts are climbing to engage!" Hawkins's voice was tight with tension. "They'll be at our altitude in 90 seconds. Webb's mind raced. If the Zeros reached 22,000 feet, the paperclip maneuver would fail. The Americans would be forced into a turning fight, exactly the kind of engagement the P-39 couldn't win. But if Webb dove now, before the Zeros could climb to intercept, he'd be attacking the bombers without dealing with the escorts first. It was a tactical dilemma, with no good solution. Attack the bombers and risk being bounced by the escorts during the climb-out, or engage the escorts and burn precious fuel in a dogfight they couldn't win. Webb made his decision in 2 seconds. All flights were diving now. Ignore the escorts, target the bombers. 1 pass, maximum damage, then we extend east and dive for the deck. Do not climb. Repeat, do not climb. We're going low and fast. It was a complete reversal of Paperclip doctrine, but Webb had no choice. The fuel situation meant they couldn't afford a prolonged engagement at altitude. Better to strike the bombers, then use their dive speed to escape at low altitude, where the P-39's heavier construction gave it an advantage. Webb rolled inverted and pulled into the dive. The world spun, and suddenly he was screaming downward at the Japanese bomber formation. The Zeros above were still climbing, not yet in position to intercept. Webb had perhaps 20 seconds before they could react. The bombers grew in his gun sight. Webb selected the lead aircraft, a G-4M Betty bomber, its twin engines glinting in the sunlight. He waited until the last possible moment, then pressed the trigger. The 37mm cannon roared. The first shell struck the Betty's right engine, the second hit the wing root, and the third punched through the fuselage. The bomber staggered, trailing smoke, then rolled onto its back and began a slow, spiraling descent. Behind Webb, the other 6 P-39s were executing their own attacks. Hawkins's target exploded in midair, the Betty's bomb load detonating from a direct hit. Rourke's burst severed a bomber's tail section. Kowalski's shells set another Betty's fuel tanks ablaze. 4 bombers destroyed in 15 seconds, but now the Zeros were diving on them, and Webb's flight was slow, vulnerable, and nearly out of fuel. All flights dive for the deck, emergency power, head for the coast. The P-39s plunged toward the ocean, their pilots pushing the throttles past the red line, coaxing every ounce of speed from their engines. The Zeros followed, but they were cautious now, wary of the Americans' dive speed and unwilling to follow them into the low-altitude environment where the P-39's structural strength gave it an edge. Webb leveled off at 500 feet, skimming over the wave tops at 320 miles per hour. His fuel gauge showed 20 gallons remaining, barely enough to reach Port Moresby. Paperclip lid to all flights, sound off. 6 acknowledgements came back. All aircraft present, all pilots alive, and 4 Japanese bombers destroyed. As Webb's flight limped back to base, their fuel tanks nearly empty, he allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. The Paperclip maneuver had evolved again, adapting to new constraints and new enemy tactics. They'd won this engagement, but the cost had been high. They'd burned fuel they couldn't afford to lose, and they'd been forced to abandon the altitude advantage that made the tactic effective. The war was becoming a contest of innovation versus adaptation, each side developing new tactics to counter the other's moves. Webb wondered how long they could keep ahead of the curve before the Japanese found a way to neutralize the Paperclip entirely. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today, they'd survived and they'd won. In war, that was enough. Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service Headquarters, Rabaul, September 3, 1943. Commander Hiroshi Nakamura stood before the assembled staff officers, his face ashen as he presented the latest casualty figures. The numbers on the board behind him told a story of systematic destruction. 47 Zero fighters lost in the past 3 weeks. American P-39 losses, 4, all due to mechanical failures or accidents, none in combat. The kill ratio had shifted from 4:1 in Japan's favor to 11.75.1 in America's favor. "Gentlemen, we are losing the air war in the Southwest Pacific," Nakamura said, his voice steady despite the catastrophic nature of his report. "The American Paperclip maneuver has evolved beyond our ability to counter it. They no longer maintain standing patrols at high altitude. Instead, they use radar to time their scrambles, arriving at intercept altitude exactly when our formations enter their engagement zone. They have altitude advantage, speed advantage, and positional advantage. We have nothing." Vice Admiral Kusaka, commander of all naval air forces in the region, leaned forward. "What about our counter-tactics, the high-altitude intercepts, the escort positioning protocols?" "Ineffective, sir. The Americans simply adjust their intercept geometry. If we climb to 22,000 feet, they scramble to 24,000. If we position escorts above the bombers, they dive on the escorts first, destroy them, then attack the bombers during their climb out. They have complete tactical flexibility because they control the vertical dimension of the battlefield. Then we must deny them that control, Kusaka said sharply. We have superior aircraft, superior pilots. How is it possible that we cannot defeat an enemy using an inferior fighter? Nakamura had anticipated this question. He'd spent the past week analyzing every engagement, every pilot report, every scrap of intelligence. The answer was uncomfortable, but undeniable. Sir, the P-39 is not inferior in the tactical environment the Americans have created. In a turning dogfight at medium altitude, yes, the Zero is superior. But the Americans refuse to fight in that environment. They have created a new form of aerial combat, vertical ambush warfare. The P-39 is ideally suited for this. It dives faster than the Zero, it can sustain higher G-loads, and its heavy armament means it only needs a single hit to achieve a kill. The Zero's advantages, turn rate, climb rate, acceleration, are irrelevant because the Americans never enter a combat regime where those advantages matter. The room fell silent. What Nakamura was describing was a fundamental shift in the nature of air combat, one that invalidated decades of fighter doctrine and design philosophy. Are you saying, Kusaka asked slowly, that we need to redesign our fighters? No, sir. I'm saying we need to redesign our tactics, or better yet, we need to avoid engaging American P-39 formations entirely until we can develop effective counters. The suggestion was met with outrage. Several officers began shouting simultaneously, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of protest. To suggest avoiding combat with an enemy was tantamount to admitting defeat. It violated every principle of Bushido, every tradition of the Imperial Japanese Navy, but Nakamura stood his ground. Gentlemen, we have lost 47 fighters in 3 weeks. At this rate, we will have no operational fighters left in the Southwest Pacific by November. The Americans are destroying us not through superior numbers or superior technology, but through superior tactics. Until we can match their tactical innovation, we must preserve our forces. Vice Admiral Kusaka raised his hand, silencing the protests. Commander Nakamura, prepare a detailed tactical analysis and distribute it to all fighter units. Include recommendations for avoiding engagement with American high-altitude formations, and begin development of new counter-tactics immediately. We cannot allow this situation to continue. Nakamura bowed. Yes, sir. As the meeting dispersed, Nakamura returned to his office and began drafting the tactical directive that would fundamentally alter Japanese fighter operations in the Southwest Pacific. It was a document born of desperation and pragmatism, acknowledging that the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost air superiority to an enemy it had once considered inferior. The directive's key points were stark. Avoid engagement with American P-39 formations operating above 20,000 feet unless Japanese fighters have altitude parity or superiority. Bomber formations must approach targets at maximum altitude, 18,000 plus feet, to minimize vulnerability to diving attacks. Fighter escorts must maintain position 3,000 feet above bomber formations and scan continuously for high-altitude threats. If engaged by diving attackers, do not pursue during their climb-out. Maintain formation integrity and continue mission. Priority targets are American radar installations and forward air controllers. Disrupting their early warning network is essential to negating the paperclip maneuver. It was a defensive doctrine designed to minimize losses rather than achieve victory. Nakamura hated every word of it, but he could see no alternative. The Americans had changed the rules of aerial combat, and the Japanese were still learning how to play the new game. Port Moresby, New Guinea, September 8, 1943. Colonel Marcus Webb read the intercepted Japanese tactical directive with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Satisfaction because it confirmed that the paperclip maneuver had achieved its strategic objective, forcing the enemy to fundamentally alter their operations. Concern because the Japanese were adapting and their new tactics would make future engagements more difficult. "They're going defensive," Captain Voss observed, reading over Webb's shoulder. "They're telling their pilots to avoid us, which means we've won the tactical battle," Webb replied. "But the war isn't over. They'll develop counters eventually. We need to stay ahead of them." The fuel crisis had been resolved 2 days earlier when a supply convoy arrived from Australia, bringing 200,000 gallons of aviation gasoline. Webb's fighter group was back to full operational capability, and the paperclip maneuver had resumed with devastating effectiveness. But Webb was already thinking about the next evolution. The Japanese directive revealed their vulnerabilities. They were afraid of high-altitude engagements. They were prioritizing defensive formations over offensive operations, and they were focusing on disrupting American radar networks. "We need to expand the paperclip concept," Webb said, spreading a map across his desk. "Right now, we're reactive. We wait for the Japanese to enter our patrol zones, then we intercept. But what if we go on the offensive? What if we take the fight to them?" Voss frowned. "Sir, our range is limited. The P-39 doesn't have the legs for deep penetration missions." "Not deep penetration, but we can extend our reach by using forward staging bases. We set up fuel and ammunition caches at forward airstrips, fly paperclip missions from those locations, then return to Port Moresby. We turn the entire Southwest Pacific into a killing zone where Japanese fighters can't operate safely at any altitude." It was an ambitious plan, requiring significant logistical support and coordination. But Webb had learned that in war, audacity often succeeded where caution failed. The paperclip maneuver had proven that inferior equipment could defeat superior equipment through tactical innovation. Now it was time to prove that tactical innovation could be scaled into strategic dominance. Lae Airfield, New Guinea, September 12, 1943. Flight Petty Officer Kenji Watanabe sat in his Zero's cockpit, waiting for the order to scramble. His squadron had been on high alert for 6 hours, ever since radar detected American fighters operating near Salamaua, 60 miles to the southeast. But the scramble order never came. Instead, the squadron commander had ordered all aircraft to remain on the ground, engines cold, pilots ready but not airborne. It was a humiliating posture for fighter pilots accustomed to aggressive engagement, but it was the new reality of aerial combat in the Southwest Pacific. The Americans owned the sky above 20,000 feet. Japanese fighters could still operate at medium and low altitudes, but venturing into the high-altitude realm meant almost certain death. The paperclip maneuver had created a vertical barrier that Japanese fighters could not cross. Watanabe had survived 3 encounters with American P-39s. He'd watched friends die, their Zeros disintegrating under the hammer blows of 37mm cannon shells. He'd seen the Americans dive from impossible heights, strike with devastating precision, and climb away before anyone could react. He'd experienced the helpless frustration of watching an enemy that refused to fight on equal terms. And now he sat on the ground while American fighters patrolled overhead, untouchable and dominant. "This is not war," muttered the pilot in the adjacent aircraft, a young officer named Tanaka. "This is slaughter." Watanabe couldn't disagree. The Americans had found a way to fight that negated every advantage the Zero possessed. They'd turned aerial combat into a mathematical equation where altitude equaled survival and speed equaled victory. The Japanese, with their emphasis on dogfighting prowess and individual skill, had no answer. "Do you think we can win?" Tanaka asked quietly. Watanabe was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Not like this. Not unless we change everything." But change was slow, and the Americans were relentless. Every day brought new reports of Japanese losses, new tactical directives that restricted operations, new evidence that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Port Moresby, New Guinea, September 20th, 1943. The mission briefing was routine by now. 7 P-39s scramble on radar contact, climb to 24,000 feet, execute paperclip attack, return to base. Webb's pilots had flown the profile so many times that it had become second nature. But this mission would be different. Intelligence reports indicate the Japanese are evacuating Leh, Webb told his assembled pilots. They're pulling out their air units, consolidating at Rabaul. This is a strategic withdrawal, gentlemen. They're ceding air superiority in the Southwest Pacific. The pilots exchanged glances. After months of brutal combat, the idea that the enemy was retreating seemed almost too good to be true. "Does this mean we've won?" Lieutenant Hawkins asked. Webb shook his head. "It means we've won this phase of the war. The Japanese will regroup, develop new tactics, and come back stronger. But for now, we've achieved our objective. We've made it too costly for them to operate in our airspace. The paperclip maneuver has given us air superiority, and air superiority wins wars." The mission launched on schedule. Webb's flight climbed to 24,000 feet and patrolled the approaches to Leh, watching as Japanese transports evacuated personnel and equipment from the besieged airfield below. A few Zero fighters provided top cover, but they maintained a respectful distance, unwilling to engage the American formation. Webb could have attacked. He had altitude advantage, positional advantage, and the tactical superiority that came from months of successful operations. But he held his fire, watching as the Japanese withdrew. There would be other battles, other enemies, other innovations required. But today, the paperclip maneuver had achieved something remarkable. It had forced a superior enemy to retreat, not through overwhelming force, but through tactical brilliance. As Webb's flight returned to Port Moresby, the radio chatter was jubilant. They'd won. Not just a battle, but a campaign. The skies over New Guinea belonged to America now, and the Japanese knew it. Washington, D.C., November 1943. The conference room in the Pentagon was filled with senior officers from every branch of the military, all gathered to hear Colonel Marcus Webb present his analysis of the paperclip maneuver and its implications for future air combat doctrine. Webb stood at the podium, a series of charts and graphs displayed on the wall behind him. The statistics were remarkable. From August through October 1943, P-39 Airacobras, employing paperclip tactics, had achieved a kill ratio of 14-1 against Japanese Zero fighters. American losses had dropped by 73%, while Japanese losses had increased by 340%. The Southwest Pacific Theater, once a graveyard for American pilots, had become a showcase for tactical innovation. Gentlemen, the paperclip maneuver succeeded not because we had better aircraft, but because we had better tactics, Webb began. The P-39 Airacobra is, by conventional measures, inferior to the Zero in almost every category. But we created a tactical environment where those conventional measures didn't matter. We refused to fight the enemy's fight. Instead, we imposed our own terms on every engagement. A general in the front row raised his hand. "Colonel, your tactics worked in the specific conditions of the Southwest Pacific. Radar coverage, predictable enemy flight paths, favorable terrain. Can this be applied elsewhere?" "Yes, sir. The principles are universal. Identify your aircraft's strengths, identify the enemy's weaknesses, and create tactical scenarios that exploit both. The paperclip maneuver is specific to the P-39 versus Zero matchup, but the underlying concept, using altitude and speed to negate an enemy's advantages, can be adapted to any fighter aircraft and any opponent." Webb advanced to the next slide, which showed a diagram of the basic paperclip profile. High-altitude patrol, diving attack, zoom climb to reset. The key insight is that energy management, the conversion of potential energy to kinetic energy and back, is more important than raw performance. A slower aircraft at higher altitude has more total energy than a faster aircraft at lower altitude. We use that principle to turn the P-39 from a liability into an asset. Then the presentation continued for 2 hours, covering every aspect of the paperclip maneuver, the tactical geometry, the fuel management, the communication protocols, the training requirements. Webb also discussed the Japanese response and how American tactics had evolved to counter enemy adaptations. The Japanese tried to neutralize our altitude advantage by climbing higher before entering our patrol zones, Webb explained. So we adjusted our intercept timing to arrive at even higher altitudes. They tried to position escorts above their bombers, so we developed tactics to engage the escorts first. Every time they adapted, we adapted faster. That's the real lesson of the paperclip maneuver. Tactical innovation is not a one-time event. It's a continuous process. At the end of the presentation, the Chief of Staff of the Army Air Forces stood and addressed the room. Colonel Webb's work represents a fundamental shift in how we think about air combat. For too long, we've focused on building better aircraft and assumed that superior technology would guarantee victory. The paperclip maneuver proves that tactics matter more than technology. I'm directing all fighter groups to study Colonel Webb's methods and incorporate them into training and operational planning. Webb was promoted to Brigadier General on the spot and assigned to the newly created Tactical Development Division, where he would spend the remainder of the war developing innovative tactics for various aircraft and combat scenarios. Port Moresby, New Guinea, December 1943. Captain Eddie Rourke, now commanding the 35th Fighter Group after Webb's transfer, stood on the flight line and watched as a formation of P-38 Lightnings taxied past. The P-38s were replacing the P-39s, bringing superior performance and longer range to the Southwest Pacific theater. But the paperclip maneuver would not be forgotten. The tactics Webb had developed were being taught to P-38 pilots, adapted to the new aircraft's capabilities. The principle remained the same: use altitude and speed to dictate the terms of engagement, strike from above, and disengage before the enemy can respond. Rourke thought back to the desperate days of July 1943, when American pilots were dying at an unsustainable rate and defeat seemed inevitable. Webb's innovation, born from a paperclip and a refusal to accept the unacceptable, had changed everything. It had saved lives, won battles, and shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. "Sir, the new P-38 pilots are asking about the paperclip maneuver," said Lieutenant Hawkins, now Rourke's executive officer. "They want to know if it really worked the way the stories say." Rourke smiled. "Tell them it worked better than the stories say. And tell them that if they ever find themselves in an aircraft that's outmatched by the enemy, they should remember Colonel Webb and his paperclip. Because the lesson isn't about the P-39 or the Zero. It's about refusing to fight the enemy's fight and creating your own path to victory." Andrabul, New Britain, January 1944. Commander Hiroshi Nakamura sat in his office, reviewing the final casualty reports from the Southwest Pacific campaign. The numbers were devastating: 127 Zero fighters lost between August and December 1943, with only 18 American P-39s destroyed in return. The kill ratio of 7:1 in America's favor had forced the Imperial Japanese Navy to completely withdraw from the region. Nakamura had spent months analyzing the paperclip maneuver, trying to understand how a single tactical innovation had caused such catastrophic losses. His conclusion was sobering. The Japanese had been outthought, not outfought. American pilots, flying inferior aircraft, had demonstrated superior tactical thinking and adaptability. "We became complacent," Nakamura wrote in his final report. "We believed that the Zero's technical superiority guaranteed victory. We failed to recognize that tactics evolve faster than technology. The Americans understood this. They took an aircraft we considered obsolete and turned it into a weapon that dominated the skies. The lesson is clear. In war, the side that adapts fastest wins." The report was filed away, one of thousands of documents that would eventually be captured by American forces and studied by military historians. Nakamura's analysis would influence post-war fighter doctrine, contributing to the development of energy-fighting tactics that would dominate jet-age aerial combat. Edwards Air Force Base, California, 1952. Brigadier General Marcus Webb, RET, stood before a class of test pilots sharing the story of the Paperclip maneuver with a new generation of aviators. The P-39 Airacobra was long obsolete, replaced by jets that could fly faster, higher and farther than Webb could have imagined in 1943. But the principles remained relevant. The Paperclip maneuver taught us that aircraft performance is only one factor in aerial combat, Webb told the assembled pilots. Tactics, training and adaptability matter just as much, if not more. When you're testing these new jets, remember that you're not just evaluating their speed or climb rate. You're evaluating their tactical potential, how they can be employed to create advantages over an enemy. One of the test pilots raised his hand. General, do you think the Paperclip maneuver could work with modern jets? Webb smiled. The specific tactic? No. Jets operate in a completely different flight regime, but the underlying principle, using energy management to create tactical advantages, is more relevant than ever. Modern jets can convert altitude to speed and speed to altitude faster than any propeller aircraft. The pilot who understands energy management will dominate the pilot who relies solely on aircraft performance. The lecture continued, but Webb's mind drifted back to those desperate days in 1943. He remembered the fear, the losses, the moment when he'd bent a paperclip and realized that the solution to an impossible problem might be simpler than anyone imagined. The paperclip maneuver had saved lives and won battles, but more importantly, it had proven that human ingenuity could overcome technological disadvantage. It had shown that the warrior who thinks differently, who refuses to accept conventional wisdom, who adapts faster than the enemy, that warrior will prevail. Legacy: the paperclip maneuver was never officially documented in wartime records. The tactic was considered too sensitive to publish, and after the war, it was overshadowed by more dramatic stories of aerial combat. But its influence persisted, woven into the fabric of fighter doctrine. The concept of boom and zoom tactics, diving on an enemy, attacking and climbing away, became standard practice for American fighter pilots in every subsequent conflict. The emphasis on energy management, on using altitude and speed to dictate engagement terms, became a cornerstone of fighter pilot training. The P-39 Airacobra, once dismissed as a failure, was reassessed by historians who recognized that its poor reputation stemmed not from inherent flaws, but from improper tactical employment. In the hands of pilots who understood its strengths, the P-39 was a formidable weapon. And the Japanese Zero, once considered invincible, was revealed to be vulnerable when faced with tactics that exploited its weaknesses. The myth of Japanese air superiority, built on early war successes, crumbled in the face of American tactical innovation. But perhaps the most important legacy of the paperclip maneuver was the lesson it taught about innovation under pressure. Colonel Marcus Webb had faced an impossible situation, inferior aircraft, mounting losses, and an enemy that seemed unbeatable. He could have accepted defeat, blamed the equipment, and waited for better aircraft to arrive. Instead, he bent a paperclip, thought differently, and changed the course of the air war in the Pacific. In the decades that followed, military strategists would study the paperclip maneuver as a case study in tactical innovation. It demonstrated that wars are won not just by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by the ability to think creatively, adapt rapidly, and refuse to fight the enemy's fight. The 7 P-39 Airacobras that flew the first paperclip mission on August 7, 1943, were unremarkable aircraft flown by ordinary pilots. But through tactical brilliance and disciplined execution, they achieved something extraordinary. They slaughtered an enemy they couldn't out-accelerate, out-climb, or out-turn. They proved that in war, as in life, the greatest victories often come not from superior strength, but from superior thinking. And it all started with a paperclip. The paperclip maneuver remains one of the most ingenious tactical innovations of World War II, a testament to human creativity in the face of overwhelming odds. If you found this story of courage, innovation, and tactical brilliance compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the Second World War. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What other unconventional tactics from W2Fu should we explore? And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the hidden history of the war that changed the world. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the greatest weapons are not the ones we build, but the ideas we create.